How did the United States get to the point where it is impossible, in most parts of the country, to get around without a private car? It wasn't always this way. Many Americans may have had more viable transportation choices 80 to 90 years ago than most of us do today, allowing us to get around quickly and cheaply without a car and with a smaller ecological footprint. Trains help shape the American landscape and alter Americans' perceptions of space and time.
In the last half of the 1800s, in North Carolina and the nation, we continued to expand the railroad network. I would say the height of the railroad expansion was the 1920s. And by that time, North Carolina had about 1,500 railroad stations. And they were everywhere. They weren't just in our major cities. They were in small towns. And Guilford County, where your college is, for example, had around 15 towns that had railroad stations, including there was a Guilford College station. So people went off to college, they rode the trains. Railroads really dominated our transportation system until the 1920s. That's when automobiles began to come in.
Henry Ford had begun to figure out the mass production and was able to begin to mass produce automobiles that were very affordable. The demand for private automobiles just exploded, and the roadways weren't ever built with these in mind, but all of a sudden you had hundreds of thousands and then millions of cars in the teens over a very short period of time. We went from one car for every 10 families or 20 families to one car for every 2 families. I mean, the adoption rates are really breathtaking. It really was a remarkably fast adoption process.
So Americans really took to the car quickly, and in the course of 2 decades, we almost entirely gave up on rail-based urban transit systems that had served many cities well. There were many reasons for the downfall of streetcars and the decline of intercity passenger rail, but perhaps the biggest factor was the lack of public investment. The first railroads would not have been profitable without huge government subsidies to cover capital and construction costs. But after a while, legislators decided to leave streetcars and railroads to the private sector, while pumping taxpayer dollars into roads.
Starting in the 20s, you really had a lot of public government money that was going into building our highway network. The tremendous highway network that we built in North Carolina was government money. It was all government money. The railroads and streetcars just developed this culture of private enterprise running them. It was before local and state governments became big governments. Today, really, in contrast, we have big governments that furnish money for all kinds of transportation programs, but that wasn't true early in the 20th century.
America has always seen roads and highways as essential public utilities that exist to serve everyone, but we somehow maintain the false expectation that privately owned railroad companies turn a profit and only provide service where there is a market for it.
Seeing, the post-war period, interstate era, we had a huge expansion of our urban areas, a huge urbanization of the population. By the 1950s, I think more than half of the people were living in major cities, and that was all about automobiles and detached homes, the cul-de-sac, development, and that was the American dream, and it was everywhere. I don't think the American public was sort of hoodwinked into thinking that it liked suburbs. I think there was a lot about it that they liked.
Americans did, and still do, seem to like suburbs. But since the suburban lifestyle is utterly dependent on the car, it is highly doubtful that it can be sustained without a continuous supply of relatively inexpensive fuel and copious amounts of cheap land on which to build detached home subdivisions, neither of which is expected to continue to be the case. But these are not the only negative consequences of a suburban, car-dependent lifestyle. As author and urban studies professor William Shutkin puts it, suburbs seem to have an insulating and inhibiting effect on individuals' civic will. By being segregated on single lots and forced to depend on automobiles for travel, suburban residents are largely deprived of the opportunity to act collectively and responsively in the face of adverse environmental conditions such as pollution, traffic congestion, and loss of open space, to which they themselves principally contribute.
This is the American dream, of freedom on wheels. An automotive age, traveling on time-saving superhighways. Futurama's free-flowing channels of concrete and steel.
Most American cities let their urban rail transit systems die before 1955, and in the following decades it seemed that the same fate awaited intercity passenger trains. In the 1960s, however, passenger rail advocates, with the backing of some visionary environmentalists, organized to prevent the train's demise. In 1970, Congress established the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, which became known as Amtrak, to operate passenger trains nationwide, thereby removing this responsibility from the private railroads, which were losing money by running them, and marking the only major federal intervention in railroading since the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. We had the chance to talk with Cliff Black, the head of corporate communications for Amtrak.
A number of events converged to eventually erode the leadership of railroads in this country. In the early part of the 20th century, the federal government began to get involved in subsidizing highways, building them. It was done for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was for better communication between cities and states. Traditionally, one of the bugaboos of passenger trains has been considered to be the interstate highway system. Another, of course, is the advent of the passenger jet aircraft. The combination of those two, with federal support that was extremely codified, made it very difficult for passenger trains to compete. And in fact, passenger trains had for many years been lost leaders with those corporations in the first place, and they declined and nearly died out completely.
Yet, the federal government did invest in the interstate highway system because policymakers had the foresight to see that the existing mostly two-lane highway system was going to be inadequate, and that a limited access highway network connecting all major cities was in our best long-term economic and national security interest.
The interstate highway system is very unusual in that it was really a top-down thing. The federal government said, okay, we've got 40,000 miles, 44,000 miles, and we're going to divvy it up in this way, and we're going to connect all the major cities above 200,000 population, and we're going to the strategic military bases and important ports and all those things into a national network. If you look back in our history, it's very unusual that we've had a consistent federal policy, anything like that. Very unusual.
But now, in the 21st century, as we face imminent energy and global warming crises and an ever-increasing population, why can't we embark on a similar national transportation initiative, but this time investing in railroads, which are the most energy and space-efficient way to move people and goods, and provide a host of other economic, environmental, and social benefits?